It was my 25th birthday, and I expected at least a warm family dinner, maybe a small cake, a few smiles, and a toast. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened. As I stepped into the dining room, the familiar smell of roasted chicken and candles filled the air, and for a moment I felt safe, normal, even happy. My father, Robert Winslow, sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, his face hard and unreadable. My mother, Vivian, gave me a weak smile, clearly uncomfortable with the tension I could sense lingering in the room. I tried to ignore the unease and greeted everyone, hoping today would at least feel ordinary. The chatter started forced at first, but I thought maybe it would settle. Then, without warning, my father slammed his hand on the table. The room went silent. He leaned forward, fixing his gaze on me, and in a voice sharp enough to cut glass, he shouted, "You're no longer family. Disappear from our lives." I froze, my mind unable to process the words. My chest tightened, and I felt something inside me break, a mix of disbelief, hurt, and anger swirling together. I had always known there were cracks in our relationship, the coldness, the constant criticism, the way my achievements were minimized or ignored. But I never imagined a day like this. My mother didn't protest. She just looked down, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The silence stretched unbearable as my father's words echoed in my mind. I wanted to scream, to beg for some explanation, but my throat felt locked, my body rooted to the spot. Slowly, I turned away, not saying a word, and left the room. Walking out into the cool evening air, the tears I had held back spilled over. The streets of my hometown in Oregon felt strangely empty, mirroring the hollow ache in my heart. I found myself wandering aimlessly, replaying every harsh word, every subtle manipulation, every time I had been made to feel small in my own family. How many years had I endured silent cruelty, the passive complicity of a mother who never intervened? How many dreams had I suppressed to meet expectations that would never recognize my worth? As I walked, something shifted inside me. Pain, yes, but also determination. I realized that this moment, as shattering as it was, could mark a turning point. I didn't need their approval, their love, or even their recognition to define my life. I vowed to take control of my future, to pursue my ambitions without hesitation, and to reclaim the strength that had always been quietly within me. That night, under the faint glow of streetlights, I understood one undeniable truth. No one could dictate my value, my path, or my happiness anymore. And with that thought, a spark of hope, small but fierce, began to grow within me. I rented a small, simple apartment downtown, far from the house that had always felt like a prison. The walls were bare, the furniture plain, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt a quiet freedom. Still, the memory of my birthday and my father's words weighed on me like a heavy stone. I felt abandoned, betrayed by the one person who was supposed to love me no matter what. Nights were the hardest, when silence made every memory louder. His harsh words, the way he always dismissed me, and how my mother never stood up for me. I spent hours looking out the window at the city lights, thinking about everything I had endured. Dreams I had buried, ambitions I had hidden to avoid criticism, all started to surface. I realized how much I had been underestimated, how everyone had assumed I would never rise above what they thought I could do. The anger mixed with sadness, and slowly, it turned into something else, a determination I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. One evening, while carrying groceries upstairs, I met my neighbor, Caleb Mercer. He was older than me, kind, with gentle eyes and a quiet way of listening. He had lost his wife a few years ago, and there was a softness in him that made life feel a little lighter. Caleb noticed my struggle before I even spoke. He didn't ask intrusive questions or give empty advice. He just offered small gestures that mattered. A smile in the hallway, a cup of coffee shared on the landing, a few words that showed he understood without me having to explain everything. Through him, I began to feel a little less alone. I realized that even though my family had failed me, not everyone would. I started thinking about my own strength, the ways I had survived all these years without support. Memories of my father's manipulations came back, how he twisted conversations to make me feel small, how he dismissed my successes, how he made me doubt myself. But now I could see it clearly, not as my fault, but as his cruelty. As the days passed, a new thought started to grow inside me. I would not just survive, I would rise. The anger I felt at being undervalued and betrayed became fuel. I began planning quietly, thinking of ways to prove to myself and to anyone who doubted me that I was capable, smart, and strong. I had been underestimated my whole life, but that would end now. Alone, but not broken, I started to feel the first sparks of power. My past would no longer control me. From the quiet of my apartment, I vowed to reclaim my life and show the world the strength that had been inside me all along. I was going through some old boxes in my apartment when I found a folder of family papers I had never seen before. Most of them were just old letters and receipts, but one document caught my eye. My hands shook as I read it. It showed that my father had taken a large sum of money from my late grandmother's estate. I couldn't believe it. All those years, I thought he was careful and respectable, but this proved he had been dishonest and selfish, putting his own greed above family. As I dug deeper, I started finding more things. Letters and notes that showed he had twisted words and manipulated family members against me. My aunts and uncles had been warned to doubt me, to mistrust me, to see me as weak or incapable. It was painful to realize that so many people I trusted had been influenced by him, all without me knowing. But at the same time, it made something inside me ignite. I could feel the anger and the clarity mixing together, showing me that I had been underestimating my own power. Around that time, I met my cousin Roxy. We had barely spoken when I was younger, and for years we had been distant. But now she reached out. She had heard about what happened at my birthday, and she wanted to warn me. We sat in my small living room, and she told me stories I could barely believe. She explained how my father, Robert, had been doing similar things to other family members for decades, cheating, manipulating, controlling, and leaving a trail of hurt behind him. Roxy had learned to stay away from him, but she wanted to make sure I didn't fall into the same trap. Listening to her, I felt a mixture of shock, anger, and relief. Shock because of the scale of his actions, anger at all the years I had been lied to, and relief that I was not alone in knowing the truth. After that conversation, I couldn't ignore what I had learned. I realized that surviving was no longer enough. I didn't want to just walk away and hide. I wanted to reclaim what was rightfully mine and make sure my father could not continue to manipulate and hurt people. I started thinking about ways to expose him safely, to show the truth without putting myself at risk. I felt a strange sense of power, the kind that comes when you finally see clearly after years of being in the dark. I knew it would not be easy. My father had influence, money, and connections. But I also knew that I had the courage now that I never had before. I had allies like Roxy and the knowledge of the truth. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could fight back. I would not just survive, I would take control, reclaim what was mine, and expose him for who he really was. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was ready. I started a new job at a small investment firm downtown. Using my full name felt like claiming a part of myself I had hidden for too long. At first, I was nervous, but I quickly realized I could handle the work. I learned fast, asking questions, paying attention to details, and taking on projects that others avoided. My confidence grew each day as I saw my ideas succeed and my efforts noticed. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere because of what I could do, not because of anyone else's approval. I also learned how important networking was. Meeting the right people, building connections, and understanding financial strategies gave me tools I had never had before. I started seeing patterns in how businesses operated and how influence worked. Everything I was learning felt like pieces of a puzzle I could use later. I began thinking carefully about the moves I could make, not just for my career, but for my life and the future I wanted to create. It was around this time that I met Dominic Hayes. He was one of the senior partners at the firm, smart and sharp, but also someone who noticed effort and intelligence. He asked questions, listened carefully, and sometimes challenged me in ways that made me think differently. He became a mentor, not by teaching me lessons I could read in books, but by guiding me to see opportunities one hadn't noticed. I respected him, and I knew he respected me too. As I grew stronger in my role, I started thinking more about my father and the life I had left behind. I knew I couldn't just let the past define me. With the knowledge and connections I was building, I began quietly planning. I thought about subtle ways to gain leverage over his business and even his personal reputation. I wasn't reckless. I wanted smart moves, careful strategies that would give me power without risking everything I had built. Every day at work, I paid attention to the people around me, the way decisions were made, and the opportunities for growth. I was learning more than just finance. I was learning how to position myself, how to make choices that would protect me and give me an advantage. Slowly, I started imagining the future I could create, one where I was no longer powerless, one where I could stand confidently and take control of my own life. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward on my own terms. I was building a new identity, one defined by my skills, my intelligence, and my determination. And deep down, I knew that all the lessons I was learning now would one day help me not just succeed, but reclaim everything that had been taken from me. My life was changing, and I was ready to take it all into my own hands. I had been learning a lot at work, and slowly I realized I could use what I knew to take the first step toward confronting my father. Quietly, I began buying shares in his company. I made sure no one noticed, not even him. It felt risky, but I was careful, and step by step, I gained a small but important part of the business. Owning that part gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. With my insider knowledge, I started looking at the projects my father was managing. One in particular caught my attention. It was poorly handled, full of mistakes, and costing the company more than anyone realized. I gathered evidence quietly, documenting everything, and then I began using it to show others how badly it was being run. I didn't announce myself, but the problems started becoming visible to key people in the company. Slowly, my father began facing consequences for the mismanagement he had ignored. Robert noticed something was off. He didn't understand why things were going wrong so suddenly. Meetings became tense, and employees whispered about issues he hadn't seen coming. He tried to fix problems, but every move seemed to make things harder. He was suspicious, frustrated, and angry, but he had no idea that I was behind it all. I stayed hidden, careful not to reveal myself, but watching him struggle gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. As this unfolded, I felt a change inside me. The fear and hurt I had carried for so long were slowly being replaced by confidence. I realized that I had been underestimated my whole life, but now I had power and knowledge he didn't have. It was a small victory, but it mattered. I could feel myself becoming stronger, more capable, and more determined to continue on this path. Even though I felt vindicated, I knew I had to stay cautious. My father was clever and ruthless, and I couldn't afford mistakes. I had to plan every step carefully, keep my actions hidden, and make sure I didn't expose myself too soon. This first strike was just the beginning. It showed me that I could act, that I could make a difference, and that I had the strength to fight for what was rightfully mine. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I was learning how to use what I had against the person who had caused me so much pain. The road ahead would be long, but I felt ready. I was taking control of my life, one careful step at a time. One evening, my mother, Vivian, came to my apartment. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting, and her eyes searching mine for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give. She sat across from me and spoke softly, almost trembling. "Elara, I think it's time to forgive your father. He's your father, and families should find a way to come together." Her words hit me like a wave. Part of me wanted to believe them, to imagine that maybe we could fix things, that somehow my family could go back to the way it was. But another part of me remembered all the years I had spent feeling small, ignored, and manipulated. I remembered the way my father had twisted words, turned people against me, and dismissed my feelings. I remembered how my mother had stayed silent, letting it happen over and over. I realized that forgiving him now would not erase the pain, and it might even let him continue to hurt others. I shook my head gently. "I can't, Mom. I can't forgive him, not yet. Not until he takes responsibility for what he's done. I've tried to survive under his control my whole life, and I won't go back to that. I won't let myself be manipulated again." My voice was firm, and I could see the surprise in her eyes. She wanted reconciliation, but I could see she understood, at least a little, that this wasn't something I could give lightly. After that conversation, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. I knew I needed support and allies, people I could trust to help me stand against my father. I reached out to Roxy, my cousin. She had always been careful around my father, knowing how dangerous he could be when challenged. When we met, I shared what I had discovered, the embezzlement, the manipulation, and the ways he had hurt our family for decades. Roxy listened carefully, her face serious, and then she nodded. "We can do this together," she said. "We can make sure people see the truth." Working with Roxy, I began to think strategically. We made plans to gather evidence, document his actions, and slowly expose the patterns of betrayal he had relied on for so long. We discussed the timing, the people who needed to know, and the ways we could act without putting ourselves at risk. It was a careful process, but it felt powerful. For the first time, I realized that exposing the truth didn't have to be reckless. It could be precise, calculated, and effective. As we worked together, I could feel the first seeds of public exposure taking root. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of anger anymore. It was about justice, about reclaiming what had been taken, and about ensuring that the people he had hurt would finally see the truth. I felt determined, focused, and ready to take the next steps, knowing that my father's control over our lives was finally beginning to fade. While going through more records and documents, I stumbled upon something shocking. My father, Robert, had hidden offshore accounts, keeping large sums of money away from everyone. Even worse, he had been involved in fraudulent dealings with local charities, taking funds that were meant to help people in need. I couldn't believe the scale of it. Everything he had done for years, pretending to be respectable and generous, was a lie. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined. I knew I couldn't face this alone, so I reached out to Roxy. She had always been careful around him, and I trusted her completely. We began planning together, going through the evidence carefully. Then I brought Dominic into the loop. He had been a mentor at my firm and understood how to navigate legal and financial systems. With Roxy and Dominic, I felt a sense of safety and strategy one hadn't felt before. We decided to challenge my father's assets legally, making sure every step was backed by solid evidence. It wasn't about acting impulsively. It was about being smart and precise. As we moved forward, I noticed changes in my father. Robert started acting differently. He questioned employees, held meetings that felt tense and defensive, and seemed to suspect that something was going on. He was trying to regain control, but he didn't know the full extent of what we had uncovered. His aggression became more visible, and I could sense that my moves were hitting him where it hurt, even if he hadn't put the pieces together yet. Watching all this, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about the anger I had carried or the way he had hurt me for years. What I was doing had a bigger meaning. I was protecting others, exposing lies that affected more than just my life. I was turning betrayal into justice. That thought gave me strength and focus. With every document we filed and every step we took, I felt more confident. I was no longer the powerless girl my father had always tried to control. I had knowledge, allies, and a plan. The feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, and manipulated was slowly fading. I understood now that revenge wasn't only about making him feel what I had felt. It was about correcting the wrongs, reclaiming what had been taken, and making sure truth and justice won in the end. By the time we prepared our case, I felt ready. I had transformed the anger and hurt into something productive. With Roxy and Dominic by my side, I wasn't just challenging my father. I was taking a stand for fairness, for honesty, and for myself. It was a turning point. I knew I could face him and the world with strength, and that my life was finally under my control. The moment finally came when the evidence we had gathered could no longer be hidden. Reports about my father's fraudulent dealings started appearing in newspapers and online articles. Journalists wrote about the offshore accounts, the mismanaged charity funds, and the patterns of deception he had followed for years. Even business partners began questioning him, reviewing contracts and financial statements with a new level of suspicion. The scandal spread quickly, and his carefully built reputation began to crumble. I stayed hidden, watching it all from the sidelines. I didn't need anyone to know it was me yet. I made sure the right people saw the proof, that the board members and investors understood the truth, and that my father's credibility was shattered without me having to confront him directly. It was incredible to see the effect. People who had once admired or trusted him now hesitated, whispered, or even openly criticized his decisions. Even family friends started to distance themselves. Invitations stopped, phone calls grew shorter, and polite greetings became distant. I could feel the walls closing in around him, the isolation that comes when the truth is finally known. Meanwhile, my mother, Vivian, began to show signs of regret. She looked smaller, quieter, almost like she was realizing how badly things had gone wrong. I wasn't sure if she would admit it to anyone, but I could see it in her eyes, the weight of her silence and the choices she had made. Watching all of this unfold, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt relief, knowing that the person who had caused me so much pain was finally facing consequences. Part of me felt satisfaction, knowing that the careful, secret steps I had taken were working. And part of me felt powerful, realizing for the first time that I could influence things, that I could take control of situations that had always seemed out of my reach. I understood that this was bigger than me. It wasn't just revenge. It was about exposing the truth and seeing justice done. Every whisper, every raised eyebrow, every cautious glance toward him reminded me that his power over people was gone. I could feel my confidence growing with each passing day. For the first time, I didn't feel like the girl who had been ignored, dismissed, and underestimated. I felt capable, focused, and in control. I knew that this was only the beginning, that there was more to do, but the taste of empowerment was intoxicating. I realized that when you stand up for yourself and take action, even quietly, you can change the course of your life, and sometimes the lives of others who have been hurt along the way. One afternoon, I received a call from my father. His voice was unusually soft, almost pleading. He asked me to meet him, saying he wanted to talk and make things right. I could hear the desperation behind his words, the way he tried to sound sincere. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part wanted to hear what he would say, to see if there was any honesty left in him. When I arrived, he looked smaller somehow, his usual confident posture gone. He tried to speak calmly, carefully choosing words meant to soften me. "Elara, I've made mistakes. I was wrong. Can we try to fix this? I want us to be a family again," he said, his eyes searching mine for a reaction. I listened quietly, my heart steady. I knew better than to be fooled by his words. I had learned over the years that his apologies were often a way to control, to twist the situation in his favor. I took a deep breath and spoke clearly, without raising my voice. I told him everything I had felt, everything he had done. I reminded him of the years I had been ignored, belittled, and manipulated. I mentioned the times he had turned others against me, how his actions had made me doubt myself, and how his words on my birthday had shattered me. I spoke of the lies, the secrecy, and the constant control he had tried to maintain. I didn't hold back. I laid it all out calmly but firmly, so there could be no misunderstanding. At first, he tried to interrupt, to twist my words, but I didn't let him. I kept going, detailing every betrayal and humiliation. I could see the change in his expression as my words sank in. He realized, finally, that he had lost something he could never take back. It wasn't just about control over me anymore. It was about respect. He had lost the respect of people who mattered, family, colleagues, and anyone who had ever trusted him. When I finished, there was silence. I could feel the weight of my words hanging between us. He looked defeated, and for the first time, I saw him as someone human, flawed, and powerless. I didn't offer forgiveness, because forgiveness was not mine to give. Not until he truly acknowledged the pain he had caused and changed his ways. I left that meeting feeling lighter than I had in years. I had faced my past, confronted the person who had hurt me the most, and stood my ground. I realized that I didn't need his approval, his love, or even his recognition to move forward. My independence was mine, and no one could take that away. I had reclaimed myself, not through revenge alone, but through truth, courage, and strength. That day marked the end of his control over me, and the beginning of my life on my own terms. After everything that had happened, I began to focus on building my life the way I wanted. My career was finally taking shape. I worked hard, made careful decisions, and started seeing the results of all my efforts. I felt proud of what I had achieved on my own. My confidence grew with each success, and I realized how capable I truly was when I stopped letting fear or the past hold me back. I also worked on my relationships. My cousin Roxy and I became closer than ever. She had stood by me when I needed someone I could trust, and now we shared more than just plans for exposing my father. We shared support, laughter, and understanding. Slowly, I began to rebuild trust with my mother. She had made mistakes, and I couldn't forget them, but I could see that she wanted to change. We took small steps, talking honestly, learning to listen to each other, and finding ways to reconnect. With Roxy and my mother, I felt like I had a family again, one I had chosen for myself, built on trust and care rather than control and fear. As I settled into this new life, I often thought about everything that had led me here. The betrayal, the lies, the years of being underestimated. All of it had shaped me, but it hadn't destroyed me. Instead, it had made me stronger, smarter, and more determined. I had learned to stand up for myself, to recognize manipulation, and to use my knowledge and courage to protect myself and the people I cared about. I understood now that my strength didn't come from revenge alone. It came from facing the truth and taking action to create justice. There were moments when I still felt sadness for what I had lost, for the family I had hoped for, but never had. Those feelings were natural, but they no longer controlled me. I could acknowledge the pain without letting it dictate my life. I had grown beyond it, taking all the lessons it taught me and using them to build a life I could be proud of. Looking ahead, I felt a sense of quiet hope. I didn't need my father's approval, his love, or his recognition to live fully. I had my own path, and I could shape it any way I chose. I knew challenges would come, but I felt ready to face them with the skills, wisdom, and courage I had developed. Sitting in my apartment one evening, watching the city lights, I felt a mix of relief, pride, and anticipation. My life had changed completely, but I had grown into someone stronger and more independent than I had ever imagined. The past no longer held power over me. I had reclaimed my life, my freedom, and my sense of self. I was ready to continue forward, confident in the knowledge that my future was mine alone to create.